Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Tim Anaya, the Communications Director for Pacific Research Institute, and we'd like to welcome you all to our panel discussion, our California Ideas in Action panel discussion on California's housing crisis. For those of you who are not familiar with PRI's work, Pacific Research Institute is a free market think tank based in San Francisco with offices here in Sacramento and also in Pasadena. And our focus is coming up with free market ideas and free market reforms to address the challenges in healthcare, in business and economics, in education and the environment, and then of course here in our home state of California. One of the key things that PRI has been focusing on in recent months is really delving into the serious challenges facing California, one of which being the housing crisis. Last month we released an issue brief on the housing crisis, and for those of you watching at home, you can download a copy of our brief Unaffordable at pacificresearch.org. And so our brief is really kind of the impetus for today's discussion of, what has attributed to California's housing crisis and how can the free market play a role in addressing affordability and housing supply. Before we begin, I want to introduce a few PRI dignitaries that we have in the audience here. First, in the front row here is Sally Stegman, who's our Vice President from our San Francisco office. And then we also have Lance Izumi, who's our Senior Director of Education Studies and someone who many of the folks in this room know well. We also have Stephanie Watson, who is with PRI's Young Leaders Circle. And then we also have, he's outside, but Paul Buckley, who just joined the PRI team, and he's our development associate. So we'd like to welcome them here as well. Now I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's panel, and that's PRI's fellow with our Center for California Reform, Kerry Jackson. Kerry is also the author of our housing brief, Unaffordable. Kerry Jackson is an independent journalist and opinion writer who has extensive experience covering politics and public policy. For PRI's Center for California Reform, he writes weekly op-eds on statewide issues and occasional policy papers. Before joining PRI, he spent 18 years writing editorials on domestic and foreign policy for Investors Business Daily. And he spent 3 years as the Assistant Director for Public Affairs at the American Legislative Exchange Council. His work has appeared in the New York Observer, the Orange County Register, the Freedman, and on Fox and Hounds Daily and Real Clear Markets. He's written for the American Media Institute and Real Clear Investigations and edited the Growth Manifesto for the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. Kerry's also served as a public affairs consultant for George Mason University School of Law. He's worked as a reporter and editor for local newspapers in the Metro Atlanta and Northern Virginia regions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kerry to start our forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That's the first time I've ever been impressed with myself after reading that. We were doing some of that. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming. And a special public thanks to Tim for setting this up and making my job easier. I don't have any comments right off. I think I'm going to save for later if I'm going to have anything to say. I'm here to learn, and putting together this housing brief, I found out, as I've told many people this morning, you learn what you don't know. You learn new things, but you also learn what you don't know, and there's a lot to learn on this, so I'm hoping this is a learning experience for you. So I'm here to introduce the gentleman next on both sides of me. To my immediate left has been Metcalf. And he was appointed by Governor Brown to serve as the director of the California Department of Housing and Community Development in November 2015. The department's mission is to provide leadership, policies, and programs to preserve and expand safe and affordable housing opportunities and promote strong communities for all Californians. He previously served in a variety of roles at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Multifamily Housing Programs. From 2004 to 2010, he was a project manager at Bridge Housing Corporation, which develops, owns, and manages high-quality affordable homes for working families and seniors. He's also worked as a research associate at the Center for Court Innovation and as a development association at Common Ground Community. I think I'm just going to read everybody's bio before then we'll get on with everybody's presentation. To my immediate right, Tim Coyle is the owner of Coyle Consulting Group, a full-service consulting company located in the state capital of Sacramento. In partnership with veteran lobbyist Steve Carlson, Tim represents a number of clients at the state capitol, notably the apartment associations of Los Angeles, San Diego, and Santa Barbara. For more than 14 years, Tim was the chief lobbyist for the state home building industry, following his service for 5 years as the state's director of housing. Before he returned to his home state of California in 1991, Tim was an official of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and appointed by President Reagan in 1981. Grew up in San Diego and is a graduate of San Diego State University, has 2 sons, and lives in Sacramento with his wife, Susan. And on my other left, my far left, I guess, Ryan Patterson. He works for the San Francisco-based law firm Zacks, Freedman, and Patterson. His practice focuses on land use, zoning, and permitting, real estate litigation, and environmental litigation. He regularly represents clients before the Planning Commission, Board of Appeals, state and federal courts, and various government agencies. He has represented clients in a wide variety of real estate cases involving code noncompliance, zoning variances, conditional use permits, construction defects, and the California Environmental Quality Act, among other areas. And I'm going to possibly mispronounce a name here, so please let me know. Previously, Ryan completed a postgraduate international business fellowship in London with the Mountbatten Institute and Fragment, Delray, Bernstein, and Lowy LLP. He also gained experience in Cairo, Egypt, at the International Development Law Organization, and has worked on statewide political campaigns and in the office of Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. But we're going to start with Ben. I think everybody gets about 10 minutes or so your turn.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me here. Thank you for hosting this important event. And Kerry, I just want to acknowledge the work that you've done with this brief, laying out a lot of key issues. I think very much aligning with a lot of the research that we've done at the Department of Housing and Community Development since I arrived there about a year ago. What I'd like to do for my 10 minutes is briefly talk a little bit about some of the findings of a recent report that we published, and talk a little bit about what I think the future may hold, particularly here in Sacramento in terms of housing legislation and housing activities. I brought a copy. Here's my prop. I'm going to wave it around a little bit. And it's a recent report that we published in draft form earlier this year that really lays out the state of affordable housing here in California, and housing more broadly, and offers up a forecast of where we see the housing markets going over the next 10 years, and then includes a suite of policy options that we think, if taken collectively, would be responsive to the housing shortage that we've identified. And these are policy options that are applicable to the local level and to the state level in particular. And I will give a quick survey, and then I'll flag Harrison, and actually wave your hand, Harrison, one of our authors of this report, so you can tackle him afterwards for more detailed questions. And he brought one copy with him that he will sign for one of you to take away. The short story, though, I think exactly affirms what Kerry's research shows, which is that we have found ourselves here in California in a very odd situation as it relates to the housing markets that are, unfortunately, I think, taking us in the wrong direction across a whole host of indicators that we as Californians should be caring a lot about. The bottom line from a supply side perspective is that we simply have not kept up with what we knew the demand was and should have been. In fact, we at the state of California have authority in state legislation unique to California that requires us on a regular interval to do forecasting, come up with the projections of housing that we expect will need to be provided in California just to keep up with household formation, in-migration, economic development. And then we take those numbers and we assign them out to our regions, ultimately down to local jurisdictions, and ask them to ensure that they have, at a minimum, just planned for the growth that we know we're going to get. This isn't planning, by the way, I should say, for hordes of Nevadans or Mexicans, Canadians kind of pouring in. Primarily, it's really just planning for the growth that we expect through sort of natural household formation. I think our projections for the next 10 years show that 75% of the growth that we're projecting is really just from our own offspring, our own children. We need to at least cover that much more than we think. And yet, historically, we don't and we can't. And in fact, if you look back at this last housing cycle over the last decade, as we have done, and compare how cities have actually measured against the benchmarks that we set through these regional allocations, you find that we have only averaged about 80,000 homes per year over the last decade, or approximately 46% of what we told cities they needed to be planning for at a minimum. Curious, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is simply that production rate is very low relative to just about any sort of peer metro area or peer competitive state. So if you look at other areas around the country that are seeing similar kinds of economic growth as California, certainly our neighbors in the Northwest, certainly our metro areas like Asheville and Raleigh and Houston and Austin, places where we see growth, we're just not building at the same rates that they are. It's also curious because we're actually not building at the same rates that we used to build at in California. So if you look back a couple decades, if you look back to the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, you see that over those years, we in California were actually building north of 200,000 units per year consistently. Now there will be ebbs and flows, certainly as the markets went up and down, but on average we were building more than double what we were building today, even with our population being much greater, even with our economic growth and productivity being much higher. Problematizing this anemic production even further, we see, and the research shows, that we are tending disproportionately to locate that new housing in the parts of the state that are not seeing the highest job growth, that don't necessarily have the best infrastructure, that are not necessarily even having things like high-performing schools or adequate transportation options to accommodate families who are looking for those homes to be their gateway into accessing the middle class. And in fact, one of the things that in this report we worry quite a bit about is that this anemic housing supply and the disproportionate location of it in areas removed from opportunity may not just be a problem from the perspective of those who are now facing with reduced supply, higher pricing for those rental opportunities or those purchase opportunities, taking up more of their discretionary income, which is problematic, but also that we may actually be seeing something that is in itself a driver that is furthering income inequality and income segregation. A couple of things that we point to in that vein are, number one, that we see a very large outmigration of our millennials right now. So of the 10 metro areas nationally with the highest rate of outmigration of millennials, 6 of those are our six largest metros here in California. Home ownership, which has historically been a path to wealth building and moving up into the middle class, our rate of home ownership dropped significantly in the financial crisis and has not recovered. It now stands at a rate that is comparable to where we were when we were last at war with Germany and Japan more than half a century ago. And for our millennials, our home ownership rate is 10% lower than it was just 10 years ago. Furthermore, despite the economic prosperity that our elected officials often rave about, we often hear the phrase, hey, California is the 6th largest economy in the world. In fact, that has not been felt evenly by those who live in California. And the number of families living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty has increased by 50% since the year 2000. So what we know is that it is getting harder for working families to access the communities where the jobs are, literally to attain the housing that would allow them to be competitive and enter the middle class. We are seeing that a growing swath of California households are now being forced into something that looks functionally like poverty. We have 1.5 million low-income households today in California paying more than half their income in housing costs every month. The United States Census Bureau now gives California the dubious distinction of being number 1 in the nation in terms of its poverty rate once the cost of living is accounted for. And of course, we see this in other very tangible ways. We see this in the very large homeless population. California has far and away the largest homeless population of any state in the nation. And we've seen very good research done lately that talks about this housing supply shortage as also being a major drag on our economy. That McKinsey Global in particular now suggests that we are seeing annually a 6% drag on GDP, some $140 billion a year in California's economy that is just not there because of lost consumption by households and lost construction activity that we ought to be seeing associated with the houses that are not getting built. Right? Okay, so take a deep breath, everybody. It's not all fire and brimstone. I think there are some reasons why we can be cautiously optimistic that with the right kinds of action, I think, and political and policy actions at the local and state level, we might be able to change some of those trend lines. And let me start by just flagging a couple things that I think do give me some hope as I look back even at the last year since I've been here working on these issues in Sacramento. We did see in the last legislative session, while not all of our housing work was successful, very significant bills, I think, in the area of homelessness. We saw a $2 billion bond funded at the state level to support capital investments to target these most vulnerable folks coming out of homelessness. We saw a suite of bills as well that were directed at making it vastly easier to build accessory dwelling units, second units, in our California communities, including many of our California communities that consider themselves built out, many of our communities that are near jobs and are near opportunity, specifically providing for, in essence, an override over some matters of local control related to inordinate parking requirements, impact fees, utility hookups, associated with the creation of secondary units in our local communities, as well with the state requirement that jurisdictions need to come up with transparent and ministerial approval processes for permitting these conversions of accessory dwelling units without subjecting homeowners to discretionary decision-making that can complicate the ability to sort of add organic new supply. And as we look ahead into the next session, I think it is, we are at an interesting moment where there is agreement within the legislative leadership in both chambers here, as well as with the governor, that there is more action that needs to happen at the state level to try and unlock this supply challenge and to really serve some of these most vulnerable Californians. The governor, in particular, has committed to working with the legislature this session on a housing package and has identified for the legislative leadership a series of sort of principles or guardrails really in any package that need to be contemplated. And one of the things that he's been very clear on is that we need both regulatory streamlining interventions as well as funding, because there are going to be populations, I talked about homeless individuals as well, and other areas where we can't count on the market itself to serve these most vulnerable populations. The 5 principles, very quickly, I think for those who have been working in this area or read Kerry's report will not surprise you. Streamlining housing development, we need to figure out ways to shorten and simplify the process to get new projects approved. California has a vastly elongated approval process on average compared to our peer states across the nation. We need to look critically at all the things that are driving up per unit construction costs, both in terms of regulatory costs as well as construction costs themselves. We need to look at the reasons why jurisdictions have fiscal incentives that sometimes steer them away from approving housing, and perhaps reward those that do make the sometimes tough political choice of approving projects even where there is local opposition to those, through, for example, linking up production with the receipt of discretionary state housing or infrastructure, transportation or infrastructure funds. Accountability and enforcement is another key principle for this governor. to make sure that our existing housing laws that already are on the books are in fact complied with, that do in many cases stipulate that local jurisdictions act in predictable and reasonable ways and deliver on their state laws. And then lastly, again, that there needs to be some funding in the mix, that even if we were able to do all the simplification, again, there has to be some ongoing, stable, off-budget funding source that needs to be a package to pull this all together. So I think bottom line, which is not an easy one necessarily to get to, but to solve a project problem this large, and one that has been so entrenched for so long, I think we have to shift away from the notion that there is any one silver bullet. We have to really embrace the notion of a suite of solutions, of a large bucket of solutions that have to all be deployed concurrently at both the state and at the local level to make progress on these entrenched issues. So look forward to be here, happy to have this conversation, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I've been told we're going to pass around some cards. We're going to have questions at the end after everybody has their chance to speak, but we're going to pass around some cards for questions that eventually will make their way up to our desk. So now we're going to hear from Tim Coyle, and thank you, by the way, Ben.
Thank you, Kerry, and Ben, excellent presentation. To PRI, thank you for staging this event. It couldn't be more timely. California has a housing supply problem. California is home to roughly 13% of the nation's population and is slightly greater than the nation in population growth. Yet, for the last 20 years, we have permits accounting for about 8% of the need. A recent study said residents in the largest coastal cities in California encountered some of the most affordable homes in the nation, caused in large part by a thriving economy and a multi-decade-long undersupply of housing relative to population and job growth. And I think Ben confirmed that just a second ago. And by the way, Ben, I'm happy to add you to the list of organizations, pretty authoritative, such as the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst and the Little Hoover Institute, UC Berkeley, and of course the realtors, the home builders, and the California Apartment Association all agree we have a housing supply problem. So, with your confirmation, Ben, you would want to look to the legislature to find out what they're doing about this particular problem, and it is a problem of immense concern to job providers as well as individual households. Yet here's a summary list of the bills that we have covering the housing package that Ben spoke of a second ago. A bill to require a 20% or more surcharge be placed on construction new housing by requiring the payment of prevailing wages. A bill to restrict the use of unapproved, vacant urban land to agricultural uses. A bill to cite new construction for greenhouse gas violations. A bill to set new rules for building housing for artists. A bill to require installation of landscaping, water meters on most new housing in only 2 years. Still another bill to force incentives on builders to produce higher density development. A bill to authorize cities and counties to mandate the inclusion of affordable housing in connection with all new housing construction. And yes, one bill to repeal the state's rent control law. These aren't addressing the issue of supply. There's just more bells and whistles on the issue of housing. A large number of these bills are spot bills, so we won't know the content of them for a while yet, but many are indicating that they would amend the state's housing element law. Underlying the housing element law is the state's good intention to take control of the housing problem and insist that local government comply. This includes advising localities how much to build and where to build it. The housing element law, as Ben suggests, looks good on paper, but notably is the greatest of toothless tigers, containing next to nothing to enforce the law. And localities hate it. They consider it the state telling their communities what to do. Nothing short of an overhaul or repeal will do for them. Worse, Sacramento is obsessed with the notion that everything that gets built in the state has to be first run through an environmental filter, particularly that which adheres to a global warming strategy. If we seriously are planning to emerge from this housing crisis we're in, we've got to stop trying to quantify what each new unit we're to build generates in greenhouse gas emissions or new vehicle miles traveled. We just need to start building again. I'm certain that for the most part, though, this legislature is clueless as to how to go about doing that. But that's okay. Housing markets function best when left alone to the private sector, and proper signals are left free to be sent to builders and consumers. First, a developer who has some sense of the housing potential in a given market begins his or her prospecting for sites primarily in the right location. Find the right location and housing type to go on it, and you can keep the remunerative proceeds, and housing is successful. Secondly, the signals coming from local government are all determined as to what gets built. The right signals produce the most housing. Finally, the signals to consumers that housing sends are supreme. They are the ultimate. They produce the goal on which lawmakers and policymakers should be concentrating their 2017 efforts in increasing supply. But while my advocacy for more building begins and ends with an appeal for a limited government intervention, there are some things that government can do, and this is really the reason for my participating today. We can replace the now defunct redevelopment law. Sacramento can do this by reenacting what had been one of the most successful housing programs of the past. The state's redevelopment law was premised on two important facts: that non-performing real estate assets could be revamped so they begin appreciating, throwing off new property taxes, and new revenues could be used to finance local infrastructure and, importantly, new housing. Said the San Diego Union, redevelopment provides economic growth by creating jobs and public spending on necessary development. It also produces affordable homes for low-income seniors, working families, and the homeless. Born in the aftermath of World War II, redevelopment became the state's economic development tool. Redevelopment essentially meant reusing and improving real estate in neighborhoods by adding and rehabilitating buildings, making more marketable properties. Redevelopment said we can profit off of the growing California population and scarcity of land, meanwhile helping to revive our cities along the way. Following its early success, there was a 20% set aside for housing added in 1976 to redevelopment law. That change produced hundreds of millions of dollars each year for lower and moderate income housing. And importantly, those dollars became a steady, reliable source of funding for affordable housing, something the state hasn't seen for decades. As recently as 2010, the state's 400 redevelopment agencies generated over $5 billion in new property tax revenue, $1 billion of which went into funding affordable housing. Redevelopment built hundreds of units in downtown LA. It did the same for parts of San Francisco and right here in Sacramento. Redevelopment funding even became a means in drug-infested properties in the Inland Empire for developers to turn those around into widely usable housing. Moreover, redevelopment created thousands of jobs and became a way for California to truly compete with other states for new businesses. Redevelopment was a win for California communities and the state. So why did the governor and the legislature back in 2011 repeal it? Because, as the governor said, the state could no longer afford redevelopment in a budget crisis, arguing that the money could be better spent directly on schools and core city and county services such as police and fire prevention. The truth is, the passage of Proposition 13 and Proposition 98, automatic funding for schools, the state changed the math and began poaching off of local redevelopment agencies. I wrote about this recently in the blog Fox and Hounds, and I think you have a copy of that that was made available to you earlier. Redevelopment was funding, among other things, for new housing, affordable to lower and moderate income households, acquisition, rehab, and of course new construction. Redevelopment dollars leveraged other private and public dollars. Some estimates were that $1 billion in redevelopment dollars became $3 billion when all was said and done. Redevelopment dollars were flexible, assisting renters and simultaneously first-time homebuyers alike. And because funding amassed for housing could be used anywhere within the reach of a redevelopment agency, usually in an incorporated city or county, it meant housing everywhere. So what's happening in lieu of the loss of redevelopment? Literally nothing. The federal government has limited funds for affordable housing. The state has nothing except enacting inane legislation dealing with granny flats and density bonuses and other bells and whistles, as I said earlier. And locals are resorting to things like inclusionary zoning to get affordable housing built. If you're not familiar with that concept, inclusionary zoning requires a new housing provider to set aside a certain percentage of new privately financed housing project. 20% is the most popular. At a discount, those units go for free or at a discount price, with the consumer of rental housing or the home buyer footing the bill. The results are predictable. Higher cost housing, few so-called affordable units, and fewer units overall. In fact, by their own account, the advocates for inclusionary zoning, while boasting the program is ongoing in 140 California communities, are proud of the fact that inclusionary zoning has, since it began in 1972, produced about 1,100 affordable units per year. 1,100 units. That's about 2% of the annual need. Someone ought to tell them. Again, California suffers from a severe housing supply problem that won't go away, and it gets worse unless the state starts to build. Lawmakers and policymakers need to singularly address that issue. And redevelopment is the key to jumpstarting new construction of housing that's affordable to everyone. Tax increment financing is the way to go.
Thank you, Tim. And now we go to our land use attorney, Ryan Patterson.
Thank you, Kerry, and thank you, PRI, for organizing this event. I think it's obviously a timely topic, and it's time for some action, hopefully at both the state level and the local level. As Kerry mentioned, I'm a land use attorney primarily practicing in the San Francisco Bay Area, and what I'd like to do today is give you a vignette or a case study of how these land use regulations actually are implemented, what builders have to deal with at the local level when they decide to build a housing project. And I'll tell you about San Francisco, as that's where I'm primarily practicing, and I think in some ways it's on the cutting edge of killing housing projects. San Francisco, if you're a builder, you buy a piece of land at an extraordinary cost, and you decide you want to build housing on it, and you submit an application to the planning department for approval to build that housing project. You are now going through a circuit of obstacles, various appeal processes, and institutional hurdles to jump. Some political, some just bureaucratic. And this often takes years and years and years to get through, if you get through it. The first step, once the planning department has finished its long review of your project application, is to tell all the neighbors of the project that you've submitted an application and that they have an opportunity to request what they call discretionary review at the planning commission. So if a neighbor objects, pays a nominal filing fee, your project now goes to the planning commission, even if it's completely code compliant. The planning commission's authority to review your project is very, very broad. It extends to areas that are not just design review. They can be concerns about impact on community character, the ever important neighborhood character, and really anything that a neighbor or a non-neighbor cares to bring up and oppose your project, and ask for either the project to be denied or conditioned or changed in some way. Basically on the fly at a hearing where citizen commissioners who are mostly not architects or professionals in the area get to redesign your project after years of work on it. If you make it through the planning commission, your next step is to go to other city agencies for review, usually a little more straightforward, but often Byzantine, the building department, public works, etc. And if those departments eventually sign off on it, then you, in some cases, get a notification sent to neighbors again, and they have another opportunity to appeal your permit. This time your permit appeal goes to the San Francisco Board of Appeals, which is a quasi-judicial citizen commission, again, largely not architects or building professionals of any kind. And this group has, again, essentially unlimited authority, same authority as the rest of the city agencies to change all of the decisions that were previously made, overturn the permit approval if they choose, or impose new conditions, or even redesign the project on the fly at a 30-minute hearing. The interesting thing to note in San Francisco is that because all permits are subject to the discretion of the Board of Appeals, all permits are deemed discretionary. And for those of you familiar with CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that means that every single permit in the city of San Francisco is subject to CEQA review, which looks at discretionary permits. So your permit is now subject to CEQA appeal, which goes to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. So the political body of the city and county, San Francisco, now gets its turn to take a look at your project. While this is a quasi-judicial function of the Board of Supervisors to review environmental determinations, the reality is I think most people would not call that purely adjudicatory. There's also a strong element of politics that can come into play. One last step, which is sometimes involved in project applications, is conditional use approval. And that is a somewhat discretionary type of permit, which some uses of land are allowed by right, despite all of these other appeal processes. Some are not allowed, and some are conditionally allowed. So there are requirements that must be met and additional hearing processes that your permit will go through. If your project requires a conditional use permit, which is likely for any project of size, that is also appealable to the Board of Supervisors, and you get another go-around in the political process. If you are lucky enough to make it through all of these appeals, and the project opponents are unhappy with that outcome, their next step is to take you to court. And the process essentially begins anew with de novo review by the court, and you're looking at years of litigation, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and untold time. So the process is difficult, to summarize it. It's convoluted, and it's very hard for an average person to even add a bedroom onto his or her house, because all projects are subject to some or all of these requirements, small ones and the big ones. Clearly something needs to be done, and I think the first step to understanding where we go with this is to look at why we're here. Why does San Francisco, why do other localities have all of these hoops to jump through? The reason, I think, is to protect established existing homeowners, business owners, the existing interests. They don't want neighborhood character change. They don't want to lose the views from their homes, which in a place like San Francisco can be quite valuable. Another interesting reason for these processes, though, is to reduce conflict between neighbors. And I think the idea was that if you can give a forum at the Planning Commission, at the Board of Appeals, for neighbors to come and express their discontent and try to work out a solution that works for everyone, then everyone's going to go home happy, and projects can be built, and the really bad projects may be weeded out. But I think just the opposite has happened, where if there were not these processes to go through, neighbors would accept construction, new development, and neighborhood change as a matter of fact, and a normal function of life and of property ownership. It's only when you create these forums for conflict that the conflicts emerge. So the reality is, I think sometimes projects are improved by going through these processes, but there are huge costs. The delays that I mentioned, you can be looking at multiple years just to get to your first hearing, and then you could be left at the end of the process with empty hands. That delay has a real financial cost that could be in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars just for financing costs to buy the land and get going. Housing construction is, as a result, rendered economically infeasible in many cases, and especially that applies at the low and moderate income levels. So if you're a developer going through this long journey to get to a building permit, there has to be a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow, or you won't embark on the trek. That's caused a situation where middle-class housing is not really being built. There's only the higher-end luxury housing that can shoulder those economic burdens, and then the lower-end housing gets built if there are government subsidies given to it, or additional subsidy burdens placed on higher-income housing projects, the affordable housing mandates that Tim mentioned. There are also no clear standards for approving or denying housing projects. It's left open to almost unlimited discretion, which, as we all know, creates a situation prone to abuse and to politicking. So the cost of the housing goes up. In communities like San Francisco, where there is rent control, the result is that tenants are evicted. There's a huge incentive for legal or illegal evictions just to clear out existing housing stock, bring it up to market rate rents. And the other result is people are leaving the city. There's a study just published saying that millennials especially and existing San Francisco residents are expected to leave in droves for more affordable housing conditions. So what is the solution? I agree there's not one silver bullet. There are a few different things that need to be done, maybe many different things that need to be done, both at the local level in changing the politics around housing and at the state level. At the local level, I think this may eventually come down to parents realizing that their kids can't move out of their homes unless we build someplace else for them to go. So how long do you want your 20-something millennial to be living in your basement because there's no place else to go? Whether they're employed or not, they simply can't afford to move out. At the state level, we need changes in policy which restrict local governments from killing housing projects. And that may take a number of forms. There are many different housing bills working their way through the state legislature right now, which is very exciting. The California Apartment Association is doing great work among other organizations in trying to change and fix the broken system here. One bill that I've worked on that I think is perhaps key to solving this change is an amendment to the state's 1982 Housing Accountability Act, also known as the anti-NIMBY law. NIMBYs, as you probably know, are not in my backyard neighbors. This law was passed decades ago during a previous iteration of California's housing crisis, and essentially says that if you propose a housing project that is zoning compliant, general plan compliant, complies with all the codes, then local governments cannot deny that permit unless they find that there are very specific, serious health and safety impacts that need to be either mitigated or require denial of the project. Unfortunately, and perhaps predictably, local governments have found loopholes in this law, and so I'm hopeful that this change to the law will go through and close some of those loopholes. This is Assembly Bill 678 and Senate Bill 133, working with the San Francisco Bay Area Renters Federation, which is a group that I represent. We're also pioneering the use of the Housing Accountability Act in fighting against governments that are turning down or squishing large projects into small projects. I think, stay tuned, there's more to come on that front. One persistent problem that hopefully the building industry will find a way to help us solve is, even if you enact laws that prevent this type of abuse, there's a time element that is very, very hard to crack. You can tell a local government you're not allowed to do this to a housing project, but they may do it anyway, knowing that they're going to lose in court. The problem is you have to go to court, and that takes potentially years, and then the hundreds of thousands of dollars of carrying costs start adding up month after month after month. And even if you get your attorney's fees paid, you still may be dead in the water with an economically unviable project. So my hope is that any of the proposals we're looking at to restrict municipalities' housing killing abilities will also be tied to some time constraint. There's the Permit Streamlining Act, which already imposes certain time constraints, but the problem again comes down to CEQA, which is not key to that timeline. So even if you say you have to approve a permit within a year, that clock may not start running until you go through the entire environmental appeal process. So one last thought is we can improve this at the state level with housing-related legislation, and we may also improve things with transit-related legislation, which allow commuters to vote with their feet more effectively than they are now. If you can't afford to buy in San Francisco or rent in San Francisco, then if there were more effective transit, more effective roads, ferries, buses, etc., you could live someplace else, commute quickly, and ease that burden on communities that are just not pulling their own weight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And it's now time, to open up for questions, and I'm going to direct first one to you. You had mentioned how hard it is just to simply add a bedroom to your house. And I remember over, I believe it was late summer, that there was some legislation passed that would allow, I think, smooth the path a little more for these granny units, or granny bedrooms as some people call them. How much does that affect the issue there of simply building a bedroom, adding a bedroom to your house?
I think it's having some effect. In San Francisco, I have a number of clients who are adding granny flats or accessory dwelling units, second units, into existing structures. That creates some additional housing. It also helps to cut through some of the politics around denying housing projects, because these units are seen as naturally more affordable, whether they're rent controlled or not. And it's hard for a politician to say no to more affordable housing in San Francisco. Other communities have a very different politics. Some more affluent cities outside San Francisco are really resisting affordable housing. There is a nexus here that's problematic with rent control, and that is state's Costa-Hawkins Act prohibits the imposition of rent control on single-family homes in communities like San Francisco, Santa Monica that have rent control. If you add a second unit to your home, you may inadvertently turn your single-family home into a rent-controlled apartment building and basically shoot yourself in the foot. So it's in some ways a trap for the uninitiated. I think San Francisco politicians knew what they were doing when they enacted the enabling legislation for this. And it may be something that needs to be solved at the state level if you want to really incentivize single-family homeowners to add a second unit or legalize the existing illegal second unit.
I'm going to open this question up to anybody up here, and as it has been said, and I think everyone believes, there is no single phrase silver bullet to solve the housing crisis, the crunch in this state. But if you had picked out one brick from the wall of barriers that we've all talked about to get rid of, if you had the power to get rid of just one single brick, what would it be? And whoever wants to speak first in that.
Sequel.
Maybe get to the same result, but in a different way, which is, I think, one of the great challenges we see in California communities is a lack of updated, comprehensive local plans. Many, overwhelming number of California communities have general plans that have not been fully updated over a period of decades. Many don't have current zoning codes. I think part of the reason we end up with all the discretion that we see that does cause the approval process to elongate is because we don't have contemporary, up-to-date planning instruments. And I do believe that if we could get to a place where jurisdictions, it's not cheap, right, to do good, thoughtful planning processes on the front end, we could then see on the back end projects able to move forward at a much faster clip. Hopefully, many more of which are drawing as of right zoning compliance and so on and so on. There is a lot of really good sort of behavioral research polling data that has been done that shows very conclusively that if you're worried about sort of the NIMBY politics issue, it's very hard to convince your man or woman on the street to build a large building when the decision is in the context of an actual structure coming in. And that holds true not just for homeowners who want to protect their obvious economic interest, but in fact also for renters. Renters themselves will turn out in large numbers to oppose development reflexively when that's the decision that's being put in front of them. And yet, in fact, when you ask polling questions that look more at the plan level, and you say to the man or the woman on the street, would you support a zoning and general plan framework for your community that ensures that there are opportunities for your children to have a place to live, for nurses and lower income workers? People will overwhelmingly say, yes, actually, that is the kind of community that I want. I want a community where there are multiple housing options. So I think to navigate the shoals of NIMBYism on the one hand, to get to things like exemptions on CEQA because you don't have to go through conditional discretionary reviews, I think a lot of it flows from having up-to-date planning processes.
All right.
I would say uncertainty is even once we get to that very necessary point of having clear community planning, the next frontier is adding layers of uncertainty. You see it in places like San Francisco and other communities where they're imposing new conditional use requirements on many, many, many activities that you would not expect to be subject to that kind of discretionary review. So even if something is allowed under the community plan, under the local zoning, you may still have to go for discretionary approval. And where there's ambiguity in design guidelines and planning code requirements, and then the additional layer of conditional use requirements, you don't know if what you're proposing will ultimately be allowed, even if on paper it is allowed.
I just have one more question. I think they're going to have some from the audience, but and again, I'll open up to everyone up here. But and maybe the fact that we're sitting here today, I don't know, but has this situation, the crunch, has it reached a fever or a boiling point now where things are really going to start moving, maybe in this year, legislative-wise, policymakers? Is it going to boil a little bit longer?
Well, Kerry, it's our collective hope, I guess you'd say, yes, we have reached critical mass. This is a full-blown crisis. We have rents in the Bay Area that are averaging around $3,900 a month. Very few people can afford that. We have home ownership rates in California having dropped around 53%. Used to be around 58%, 57%. I think, Governor Brown has, here in Sacramento, probably tried to unravel some of the problems that this group has identified. The environmental process, the process Ryan described, where you go from one entity to the next entity, the political process. He's attempted to streamline the permitting process, both as mayor of Oakland and governor of California. And yet the legislature, like I said earlier, they choose to add only superficial bells and whistles to the existing law, and density bonus and drain flats are fine, but we're in the middle of a housing crisis where we got to build. We've got to build new housing, and this group of legislators here in Sacramento today doesn't seem like they're ready to take that on.
I'm hopeful that this is going to be the year we see some change. Look at housing prices. There's a lot of furor over that. On the Democratic side of the aisle, I think people are concerned about affordability of housing, which is reaching crisis levels, obviously. On the Republican side of the aisle, I think people are especially concerned with the impact on private property rights, which is concerning. Even if you own a piece of land and everything's allowed by code, your ability to use your land just to build a house on is in peril under current law. So I'm hopeful people are starting to realize that, and there will be a coming together and some action. Probably won't get everything we want to see this year, but hopefully some of it.
I think if anybody has a definitive answer on this,
Well, look, I think from my perspective, we have a governor who's out front this year with their commitment and expressed intent to work for a housing package. We have leadership in the Senate that rolled out earlier this year an infrastructure package, which put housing front and center as part of the infrastructure package. We have a package on the Assembly side that includes many of the stuff we've talked about that was rolled out by the Speaker with the Chair of the House Committee, that includes accountability measures, streamlining measures, new funding sources. So yeah, bottom line, I think we have alignment in terms of all the leadership and the chambers of the governor saying we want to do housing this year. I can never keep track of how many bills there are. You know, people, I think something like 130 bills have been introduced that have that tackle housing, and I think Tim's right. Many of them are pretty small ball, but some of them are pretty significant. And the fact that names attached to these 130 bills does suggest to me a little bit of a groundswell. I'm not saying again quantity of measures is not equal quality, but I think there's definitely a desire to do something, and definitely a notion that we may be able to actually do more by packaging. Although there is a widespread consensus that we need to take action on housing, every angle you pick historically gets attacked by certain political interests, and in a way, packaging it together may actually make it so that we get some momentum here, and everybody says, well, okay, I'm going to take a pound of flesh because we're moving forward to larger solutions. So I think that's the reason to be cautiously optimistic as we look ahead this year to what the legislative session might bring.
Now, I think Tim has some questions or some audience members.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Eric Myers. I'm a real estate attorney and broker, member of the California Association of Realtors. I work primarily in the San Francisco East Bay. I want to thank the organization and all the panel members this morning for being here. You guys are a really smart group of people, and I've really enjoyed your insights and your analysis on what we've all known in the real estate industry just intuitively is happening in our state. So my question kind of centers around the fact that one of our local jurisdictions, Richmond, California, recently passed rent control and just cause ordinance by a 2/3 vote of the citizens who cast their ballots in the last election. And in talking with many of the proponents, the kind of ultra-progressives that had the ordinance drafted and put on the ballot, they freely admitted, even publicly, that rent controls were not a solution to the housing crisis. However, they admit, like we all do, that we have an affordable housing crisis, and they just had no other tools or ability or incentives available to them to address the affordable housing issue other than to do something, and the only thing they can think of is to control rents. And so I guess my question for you is how, on the local level, can we best educate, assist, and incentivize local governments to increase affordable housing and eliminate rent controls?
Well, first of all, yeah, I was aware of what they did in Richmond last year. The issue of rent control and the desire to pursue it stems from an emotion that you or I, can't fathom. That's assuming you have an affordable place to live. The emotions of residents to the skyrocketing rents in the Bay Area, for example, are understandable. And I don't think educating consumers or residents about the ills of rent control, the fact that you stifle new construction, the fact that you probably promote deteriorating housing conditions by reducing income on rent. I think what you need to do is start building, and seeing is believing. Like I said earlier, the signal that is sent to consumers that new housing has arrived is powerful, and seeing is believing, and I think residents will back off their desire to quell those emotions for something like, relief, rent control, when they see housing being built.
If I may, I'm going to go out on a limb with this crowd and say, I actually do believe that rent stabilization laws, if properly crafted at the local level, can achieve a very worthwhile public goal of mitigating inherent instability in the rental markets that we know from the research have very negative impact, particularly on lower-income families with kids in terms of educational attainment. And if done, under the construct of Costa-Hawken, can be narrowly applied only to pre-1978 structures and so on and so forth, and should not inherently be an impediment to new construction. That said, you're spot on with the challenge we have, and I think part of it is that we are up against a population that, particularly in Bay Area communities, is fundamentally anti-development. They are not what I would consider sort of, in the main rational actors, in the sense of they do not understand when you go and you speak to them and you survey them on the street that if we can add more supply to more Bay Area communities, we should see some amelioration of rents, mitigation of rents, and so on and so forth. So I think there is simply a piece of sort of voter education, resident education that is not happening. We do not have good people who are out there trying to help people understand that the reason the rents are going up is because we're in the throes of a multi-decade long massive supply shortage that is simply not keeping up with the growth that we need. And that, and we can blame our local elected officials and these bizarre Byzantium, Byzantine kind of processes that we've built, but at the end of the day, they are reacting to felt political pain from their constituents who are going to throw them out of their jobs if they don't listen to them on these kinds of issues.
I think it's important to understand there are different impacts of different types of rent control policies on different actors. So depending on how rent control is implemented, you may constrain the housing supply further if people decide not to rent out vacant apartment units. You may also increase the value of existing housing stock by constraining construction of new housing stock. So there are winners and losers in this, and you have to look at what type of policy is implemented. To really answer your question, how do we educate people? I think the answer is better economics education in high school.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you both all for being here. Echo the comments of the last speakers. Refreshing to hear these kinds of things coming from a free market standpoint. So often we hear solutions that involve more government intervention. So my name is Rob Smith. I am with the North State Building Industry Association. We are affiliated with CBIA. I'm a legislative advocate at the local level, City of Sacramento, other cities in the local area. And my comment, my question is centered around that of local government. And Ryan, you spoke a lot about this already. I want to piggyback off that a little bit. Most permitting and zoning decisions are at the local level. And a lot of local government objections I've found stem from constituents. Local city council members are no different than members of Congress or the Senate. They want to keep their jobs, so they want to listen to their constituents. A big one is the NIMBYism factor that was mentioned. A lot of residents, already homeowners, they like scarcity, keeps their home values up, and I like to say today's new home buyer is tomorrow's NIMBY. So what's different about California, and I don't believe NIMBYism is only in California. You have NIMBYs in any city in America. The difference is California empowers NIMBYs largely through CEQA, as you said. This is especially prominent in affluent suburbs, and that's an issue that you addressed, and I think from my standpoint, CEQA is a huge barrier, and that needs to be addressed. But my question is going to stem on another group of residents that largely don't understand the economic concept of filtering. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about filtering. Filtering is the concept that housing becomes more affordable as it gets older, and there's this key misconception among people that I talk to, a lot of times they're renters, people that are not already homeowners, but are still voters and have the attention of elected officials, city council member, county supervisors. And that's the thinking that development somehow causes high housing costs, or at minimum contributes to it. You all spoke of supply very early on in your comments. I think everybody in here, I can take for granted, I think the audience where we're all coming from, fundamentally understand that you increase supply, you keep price pressure down. I'm shocked at some of the people that I meet with that don't understand this. I'll give you an example. The city of Sacramento is going through their downtown specific plan update right now. They commissioned a survey online, asked a lot of questions for people. One of the questions they asked was, what concerns you most about increased development downtown? Some of the answers you would expect, traffic, crime, that sort of thing. The number one answer for people that took the survey was being priced out of the market. So what came to their mind when more development downtown, I can't afford to live there. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that notion. You're always going to deal with an NIMBYism, but I think that there's also a large group of people, a large of those who are renters, want to maybe be homeowners, feel like they're being left out, and they see new development going on, and they feel like they're missing the boat rather than that being a good thing and a good sign for them to be future homeowners.
I'll jump in. First of all, I don't know that filtering is a useful concept in terms of changing hearts and minds. And I guess I'm not even completely sure how powerful that is in terms of the economic research. If filtering is helpful, it's helpful decades out on apartment buildings. What I think is more helpful to do if you're trying to make kind of an argument here is just to point to what we know in terms of the ability of it sounds like an obvious statement, but sometimes you have to walk through it. Today in our California communities, it is our upper income households that are outbidding consistently our middle income and lower income households for housing stock that really is appropriate for middle income persons. In other words, we don't have housing options that are adequate to house the folks who have the disposable discretionary income to be able to afford to buy or rent those units. And so they consistently outbid the folks who can't, relegating those folks either to crowded up situations, long commutes, or moving out of the Bay Area. To your larger point, this is the crux of the issue here. I think we do collectively need to really wrestle with how we can better communicate the story here and tell the story here in a way that resonates again with your man or woman on the street. I was very struck by a recent report by the Enterprise Foundation called by the Frameworks team that really looked at some of the ways in which the words that we often use in our day-to-day conversation, issues like supply or building new housing units, actually backfire because they create frameworks for folks that are play into narratives that they have, which are exactly as you described, suggest that they're not going to be a beneficiary of that, this is for somebody else. And we need to really think about how we can tell a story that is inclusive of, helps people understand that the communities that they aspire to, the things about their communities that they value, the ability for their neighbors to be able to attend community events and join the baseball team is contingent on their neighbors being able to afford the housing that they have, which is contingent on the supply being adequate to what the need is. So there's a story that I think we collectively are not telling that would be very helpful here. I'm also struck by the fact that we need to figure out some of in terms of telling that story, I think we also need to look to some of our civic institutions, our business leadership, to get out there and really tell that story, so that we're not fighting this on a project basis. I think groups like the Bay Area Council, the Bay Area Orange County Business Council have gotten very good, I think, at beginning to realize that that's part of their mission as business leaders. They need to be helping provide some of the literally marketing material, the video campaigns, the blogs and viral stuff that helps tell the story a little bit better and gives the folks who are actually developing some of the tools, the language, the frameworks, if you will, that can help them to win the hearts and minds. Because I think otherwise, right out of the gate, we're running up against sort of a visceral opposition from folks in those communities.
Anyone else?
Well, I was simply going to give you an answer that you're probably not looking for. housing has become more expensive, and that's thanks to government. Government's responsible for $130,000 fees in the city of Livermore. Government's responsible for CEQA for $175. You can go into a municipal court and qualify to bring a multi-million-dollar housing project to a grinding halt. So until building housing, which would be the ultimate way, as I said earlier, of educating people, the more, if they're looking at one individual project, you get allocated this project here, and then 6 months later or 8 months later, if they're looking at that one single housing project, chances are they are going to be priced out of the market. The consequence of limited production has an impact, as you really admit, on price. And the more housing that goes up, the more affordable it will be, and it'll keep that increasing supply will keep the clamp on prices, and at the same time will educate consumers about not being priced out of the market. The rents and the home prices are likely to be more affordable the more housing that gets built. As long as you're stuck where we are right now, in that situation where you can do this housing project and limit it to just that, chances are that'll be a higher cost housing project, and that will affect the affordability of renting or owning.
I'll say very briefly, the problem is one of, if you don't build housing for people at the higher income levels, they're going to outbid people at the lower income levels, and then they may lose their housing. But the message delivery, I think the most effective means I've seen is for younger people who are the age of the children of those homeowners or those families who are renting to say, we have no place to live. I think that resonates in a visceral way that cuts through politics.
Well, we're running up on noon, and we have to be out of here. I don't know if the lights go off right at noon or how this works, but I think we have time for one more question. I had several rent control questions from the audience, but I think maybe we've addressed that a little bit, or it's been addressed. So let's call this, as someone said earlier, the lightning round, maybe 1 minute per answer on this question. Other states, such as Florida and Texas, face similar challenges like the state of California housing, but they don't face California's housing and building challenges and the housing challenges also here. Can anybody want to address that?
Supply breeds affordability.
There's quite a bit more available land, and so I do think one of the challenges that we do impose on ourselves here in California, which we shouldn't take lightly, is the notion that we need to be encouraging infill development in order to help achieve California's climate change goals. I think when you look at places like Houston, they are able to really develop in ways that we can't because of geography, but also because of our policy goals around climate change.
I haven't said much as far as making comments, but Houston has been an interesting place to me. And as far as I know, it's interesting to bring up to me. As far as I know, they still have no zoning laws in that city. Well, you would know, I guess, if that's correct.
I think that's correct. I think Ben may know better than I that the older law of nuisance, I think, is used to regulate some of those things. And my answer would be less restrictive zoning.
I think that does it. Anything else, Tim? All right. We appreciate everyone coming. Everybody have a nice day.